thank you all for being here. I am really grateful for Kathy for hosting us and all of our elected officials and community leaders who are joining us today. In Minnesota, we have a motto that says we are greater than hate. And many of the people that you will hear from today have been people who have exemplified that call and have really worked to make sure that our communities are free from hate and that we are building solidarity with one another. There have been over 100 mass shootings this year, including 7 in 7-day span last week. With the trauma of what our community has dealt with after the murder of George Floyd, with the uptick of hate, violence against many of communities of color in our communities, it's hard to it's important for us to underscore just how much our communities are living in terror. In Colorado, 10 people were murdered just because they happened to go grocery shopping. In Atlanta suburb, 8 people were killed in a series of shootings targeting Asian American women. This was not an isolated incident. In the latest numbers released by the FBI, hate crimes reached their highest level in more than a decade. Asian American hate crimes rose more than 150% in major metropolitan areas. Much of this hate has its genesis online. This past year, the number of online white supremacist incidents, which included the distribution of racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-LGBT flyers, stickers, banners, posters more than doubled, reaching its highest level in history. Asian Americans reported the highest uptick in serious incidents of hate and harassment, with nearly 20% reporting harassment. In many of these attacks, bystanders alone allowed it to happen. A report released recently studied my own Twitter mentions. They found that almost 60% of these accounts who mentioned me used explicit hate speech, whether it was anti-Muslim or anti-immigrant rhetoric. Of course, I did not need to see the report to know that. I am inundated with it every single day. As Minnesotans, we could not afford to be silent on the source of this hate. Right-wing extremists were linked to at least 16 extremist-related murders in the United States in 2020 and have been responsible for 75% of such murders in the last 10 years. So it is important for us not to only speak out against hate speech and violence when they target us. We cannot be bystanders to hate and harassment experienced by marginalized groups. We must condemn it universally. We must remember that our destinies are tied together. An attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. So yes, we need to prevent gun violence and make sure that guns do not end up in the hands of criminals. But we also need to create a culture that does not tolerate hate as a normal part of political discourse. I want to applaud Samantha Fing and Frank Hornstein for leading legislation to expand and improve hate crime reporting in Minnesota, and for advancing that legislation in the Minnesota House just a few days ago. And I'm also proud to support similar legislation that's taking place at a federal level. It has also become clear that these technology platforms do not take seriously their role in providing a platform for white nationalist hate and dangerous we as a nation need to think seriously about ways to address online treatment to our safety and to our democracy. So we have a number of speakers today who have direct experience with the uptick in hate and who are working on solutions. First up, I would like to introduce our Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan, someone who has been a champion for people of color, Native Americans, immigrants, refugees, and low-income folks here in Minnesota.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really grateful that Representative Omar brought us all together and brought this group of folks across different jurisdictions and across communities to come together to say that we stand up against hate in any form in our state. As she mentioned, we are experiencing a real time of trauma in our state in this moment. People are hurting, and there are folks who would also seek to agitate and divide us in this moment. And that's why it's important for us to come together and say that that is unacceptable and not what we will tolerate here in the state. The shootings that occurred in Atlanta, the increased attacks against our Asian Pacific Islander community are unacceptable. And we cannot deny the racism and misogyny that is deeply embedded in our culture that also stokes the flames of that kind of behavior. For a year, we have heard, as the Congresswoman mentioned, both on online platforms and coming from leaders, hate-filled rhetoric against so many, but against the API community and immigrant community. And it has to stop because we've seen what the consequences are to that kind of language. To our API community members, we stand with you. We will continue to stand with you. And to know that sometimes in these moments, it's hard to know what to do. And as Representative Omar said, we cannot afford to be bystanders in this moment. We cannot Minnesota nice our way through the uncomfortable realities that face us. Representative Ornstein and Representative Vang and Senator Latz have introduced legislation that will help to strengthen our hate crime laws here in the state of Minnesota. And the governor and I are enthusiastic supporters of that legislation and urge the Senate to give it a hearing and get this done because it is time. There are things that we can do. There are things that we must do. And I know that I have my other brother here from White Earth, and as Indigenous people to this land, who were here, who our ancestors were here before Minnesota was Minnesota, to our API and immigrant community, you're welcome here. You're Minnesota, and we're grateful to have you. And we will continue to stand in solidarity across jurisdictions in the face of hate, lifting up the legislation that Representative Omar is working on and that our friends are working on here in the legislature. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And next, I would like to introduce Ekta Marakash, CEO of CABI here in Minnesota, originally founded as the Center for Asian and Pacific Islanders. CABI now serves immigrants from East and West Africa, India, Nepal, Myanmar, Bhutan, Thailand, Burma, and is the largest nonprofit service provider for immigrants.
Thank you, Representative Omar, for organizing this press conference and shining a light on hate impacting our communities. The uprising in hate against Asian Americans across the country is unacceptable. It needs a period stop. Here in Minnesota, many of our community members, clients, and participants have shared what they've seen. I myself feel a little fear when I'm walking down the street in Minneapolis or going to a grocery store. That was not the case when I came 20 years ago. But I know in history, there has been many acts like that has happened in the API communities. And we are get together to make a change. As a CEO of CAPI, we have worked to provide resources to all of our immigrants, refugees, and pride. That includes many API communities. We have been serving in Hennepin County for the last 39 years. And we are very, very proud of our work. We know our country is greater than beyond hate. This is not very deep. This is not fair. And I'm very proud to stand in solidarity with all our leaders here today to condemn anti-Asian hate. We want to make a better community, a safer community. When I say I think about my children, I think about my neighbors, I think about everyone. We need to stand together, fight against racism. It doesn't matter what the color you look like, but it's important that humanity is there. We are not here to target one another, because that's the problem. We are here together for all of us. Attack on one community is attack on all of us, and we don't want to see that happen, and we get divided. If we keep seeing what's happening in Atlanta and Colorado, or in Minneapolis, and we just witness and just let it go, then we are responsible. So as an organization leader, I pledge on behalf of my board and the staff that we need to stop this together. With that, I just want to say thank you to all of you leaders here and for the wonderful welcome that this is Minnesota. This is our
Thank you. And next, I'd like to introduce Samantha Bang, who is a Minnesota representative from District 40P.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Congresswoman Omar, for organizing us. Thank you, Kathy, for hosting us. And thank you all the leaders for joining us today. My name is Samantha Bang, State Representative, Chair of the Minnesota Caucus, People of Color Indigenous Caucus, and founding member of the Minnesota Asian Pacific Caucus here in the legislature. Although the gun violence that took place in the country has been a few weeks ago, this is an important reminder of the work left for us to do to prevent further gun violent deaths and hate crimes. These sensational events are a rallying call to action, but it is up to us to do the rest of the work. Words matter. And as Minnesotans, we must continue to call a stop to hate when we see it, when we see it across the country. Common place to exhibit hate and violence against the Asian American community. Racism is a public health crisis, and silence amidst the burn of growing surge of violence against our fellow Asian Americans is unacceptable. And we demand justice, whether it is in our own communities in Minnesota, or in Georgia, or anywhere else in the country. As Representative Omar mentioned, anti-Asian hate crimes rose more than 150% in major metropolitan areas. Asian Americans reported the biggest uptick in serious incidents of hate and harassment ever. These attacks are rooted in racism, and we all must play a part in combating it through collective action. Addressing this violence requires education and understanding from all of us, as well as civil rights protections to uplift all our communities. Furthermore, a continued push for common sense gun violence prevention policies, because we have seen racism reared its ugly head, turn deadly with a gun. I also encourage my fellow Asian Americans to continue to tell your stories, because only then will we continue to be heard. That's why I'm proud to author a bill to expand and include hate crime and bias reporting. This bill will go a long way for giving us the data of understanding of the rise of hate crime, so we can actively work to prevent this crime. Thank you, Representative Dorsey, for bringing forward House Bill 1691. Next, I call upon my Senate Republican colleagues to take upon this bill for support and ensure all is safe from hate. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I would like to introduce Bo Tao Arabi, Executive Director of the Coalition of Asian American Leaders.
Thank you, Congressman Omar, for bringing an Coalition of Asian American Leaders. Of course, we are heartbroken and devastated by the continued violent attacks against our community, many of whom are already reeling from the deep personal loss of the pandemic, struggling with economic downturn, just like all communities. Nobody should have to endure targeted violence like this. As North America, in America, I share my community's deep grief and pain, but I also share my community's great disappointment and sorrow that again, we have to justify our experiences in order to be seen and accepted. Because we know that misogyny, white supremacy, and xenophobia is what is harming us right now. Like many Asian Americans, I grew up hearing questions like, do you know Kung Fu? Does your family eat dogs? Where are you really from? More times than I can count. And had people follow me and stop me to just make derogatory gestures, slanted eyes, but just because they wanted me to know that I did not belong. I've also experienced more egregious forms of hate, from having things like book etched into my car, my parents having their garage and cars smeared with feces, and being bullied in school. All of these incidents are not unique to me. They are the experiences of many Asian Americans. But I've always told an authority figure, whether that is a principal, a boss, or police. Unfortunately, little action followed, and things did not change. And that's why I don't believe that we can police racism away. Beginning in February 2020, I started receiving more messages than I've ever had since our organization's founding in 2013 about anti-Asian discrimination and violence. The first came from one of our leaders who shared with me a text that she received from someone who texted her saying he hated Asians and that he had been hired to assassinate her. Then another shared that her elderly mother and aunt were being targeted by neighbors who were using derogatory racist language to intimidate them. Still, another shared how she and her husband went shopping to buy essentials during the pandemic closures. And as they were leaving, another customer followed them out to their car and told them that they were to blame for the coronavirus and pushed her husband into the trunk. She said this time it was just shoving, but what if the next time someone decides to run us over with their car or shoot us? There's nothing we can do to hate us for being Asians. I can hear her fear, and what's more upsetting and concerning is that none of these people who reported and shared with me their stories felt that others around them would have done anything. And in fact, many didn't do anything. And none felt that institutions would give attention or help to actually change things if they reported it. As others have shared, last year the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism reported that Minnesota ranked 15th among all states for the highest number of reported hate incidents against Asian Americans in the country. And although across the country, hate incidents, hate crimes decreased, it increased 150% for Asian Americans. I also want to say this is not just about interpersonal violence. As a community, we know that this violence is also systemic. And for centuries, the U.S. banned our communities from coming except as exploited workers, and were barred from citizenship until just 69 years ago. In addition, throughout the U.S., our U.S. history, immigration and economic policies have treated Asians as disease-ridden, criminal, subhuman, or superhuman, uncivilized, and threats to white American workers. This history just started turning towards greater inclusion and equality in the last century because of the hard-fought civil rights struggles led by Black Americans. This soon ended for Asian Americans, who were then labeled the model minority. And since then, I should say, since we've been here since the first ships arrived here in America, but we've continuously experienced exclusion because we are seen as perpetual foreigners. So yes, all people deserve to feel safe going about their daily activities, but we are not truly safe until everyone is safe. Our cities, our counties, and our country has a duty to protect all of its people. And we must begin by acknowledging the truth of our past so that it won't continue to be our future. We can and should do better to move beyond kind of just the chronic empathy of when crisis happens to communities of color. It's time for us to take action, and that's why we're urging Minnesotans to support Senate File 2003, which others have shared and has passed in the House to close the loopholes on hate crimes classification, to allow for victims of hate to report incidents to non-law enforcement entities like us, because communities prefer calling us than calling agencies and the police, providing victim services for those who have experienced hate, as well as providing support and restorative justice approaches for those in communities. We stand in solidarity with all Minnesotans and Americans who understand that to end racism and misogyny, we must see it for what it is and work harder across and between our communities so that we can do better and stop hate.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce our Irene Fernando, Hennepin County Commissioner for District 2.
Hello everyone, I'm Commissioner Ilhan Fernando, but you can call me Commish. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak today. In 2018, Commissioner Angela Conley and I were elected as the first commissioners of color on the Hennepin County Board in our 169-year history. That same year, Anoka County Commissioner Mandy Meissner and I were the first Asian Americans elected as county commissioners in the state, and I'm also Minnesota's first Filipino American elected official. I share this because my title and the elected titles of those who are speaking here today originate from a time where we would have been considered subhuman in the eyes of the law. We carry power and responsibility from a time where we would have been considered subhuman. The systems do not work for all of us because they were never designed for all of us. We need to go way back to begin to correct the societal issues that lead to hate and racism, and we need to change the laws to center our shared humanity. We don't need more data or dashboards in order to act. Our friends and neighbors who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color continue to face devastating structural inequities in housing, income, employment, and healthcare. We are dying literally at greater rates during the pandemic because our households are multifamily or multi-generational, or because of the frontline work in grocery stores, hospitals, and everywhere where you frequent. While our experiences of discrimination and injustice may not be the same, our oppressor is. White supremacy, misogyny, and capitalism that exploits people to produce profit all feed into the hate we are talking about today. Only by coming together to fight these forces will we succeed. And so I thank each of you for the role you are playing in it, and certainly want to thank Congresswoman Omar for how you fight on our behalf every day. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Frank Hornstein, Minnesota State Representative for District 61A.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Congressman Omar, for bringing us all together. My name is Frank Hornstein. I'm a state representative representing a district in Minneapolis. And as was mentioned earlier, Representative Mang and I have advanced legislation in the Minnesota House of Representatives on this issue of hate crimes. And one of the key parts of that legislation is to increase the reporting of these heinous hate crimes. Only 1/3 of hate crimes are reported. That is wrong, and it needs to be corrected. And we know when there's a shooting in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, or the atrocious act in Atlanta, or the shooting at Walmart targeting the Latinx community, those are very public and reported. But so many thousands of hate crimes are not reported. And when they go underreported, they are not discussed, and the perpetrators are not held accountable. So that's a key piece of what we're trying to accomplish, particularly in this moment when our brothers and sisters from the AAPI community are under threat and have been under threat since COVID and even before. It's particularly important that we recognize this and address it. Finally, in this week when Jews are, like myself, are celebrating Passover, Christians Holy Week and preparing for Easter, the Muslim community preparing for Ramadan, there is a message in all of these holidays of unity and of justice. So let's keep that in mind during this holy season. And Congresswoman Omar, again, thank you for reminding all of us that an attack on one is an attack on all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Steve Fletcher, Minneapolis City Council member for Ward 3.
Thank you, Congresswoman Omar. My name is Steve Fletcher. I have the honor of representing Ward 3, which includes neighborhoods in downtown and the University District that are vibrant centers of Asian cultural life. And it is so important to me that people feel supported in this moment. The tragedy that happened in Atlanta didn't happen here, but certainly the conditions of racism and misogyny that created that shooting and that informed that shooting also exist here. And we have to be aware of it and we have to be responsive to it. But these shootings have the effect of creating terror. And I can tell you that as a Jew, when the Tree of Life shooting happened in Pittsburgh a couple of years ago, I felt something in the pit of my stomach that was deep and awful. And I'm not raising that to equate anti-Semitism with the anti-Asian racism that we saw, but to name the importance of community in pushing back. To name the importance of community in pushing back to say, this is not us. This is not who we are. You are supported. And it's so important to me that everybody in our community hear that message. That the Asian Americans who live in our city, whether you are Minnesotan for generations or whether you are here on a student visa for a short period of time, you are a valued member of our community. You are welcome here. You are loved. The racism and misogyny that have informed that we've seen on the rise are not welcome. It is critical that everybody hear that message. It is critical that we act. Thank you to Representative Hornstein and everybody at the legislature who's working to take action on this issue. And we will do everything that we can to continue for this to be a welcoming city for everybody who chooses to make this their home. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Philippe Cunningham, Minneapolis City Council member from Ward 4.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Philippe Cunningham, and I am proud to serve as the Minneapolis City Council member representing the 4th Ward in North Minneapolis. I am proud to represent the city's largest concentration of Southeast Asians in Minneapolis. I love our community because of the fact that we have our AAPI neighbors. One of the things that I think is very important is to name that today is Transgender Day of Visibility. And as a transgender person myself, I am grateful to have this opportunity to stand in solidarity with my Asian Pacific Islander neighbors, friends, and family. Here in Minneapolis, we will not tolerate racist actions or attitudes against Asian Americans. Here in Minneapolis, we will not be complicit in any forms of bigotry or hatred towards our AAPI neighbors, friends, and family. Here in Minneapolis, we recognize that an attack on one of us in our community is an attack on all of us in our city. As the first trans man of color elected to office, I am certainly no stranger to attacks and bigotry. And I think that it's really important to think about the layers of hate and bigotry that Asian, Pacific Islander, LGBTQI members of our community face. It's important for us to think about those additional challenges that get layered on as well when we talk about hatred and misogyny and white supremacy. The attacks on LGBTQ folks and Asian American folks and those who live at the intersections of those identities, those are interconnected. In order for us to be able to have a more inclusive world for all of us, we must ensure members of our AAPI community are included in our conversations around racial equity. As a council member, I have made it a priority of mine to make sure that as we are talking about racial justice and racial equity, as we prioritize that as our city's #1 focus, that we do not lose the Asian American Pacific Islander community in those conversations. We cannot allow stereotypes like the model minority to erase the challenges that are faced by our AAPI neighbors, friends, and family. And I'll close out with saying that if you are a member of our community, our neighbors who are Asian or Pacific Islander, and if you have experienced discrimination, please call 311 and report it to the city, the Minneapolis Civil Rights Department. We are here to be able to provide you those supports, those protections. Please use that resource. That has been very important to us as a city council to ensure that we have those kind of resources available to protect you. So please make sure that you use it. I'll just say also that we love you here. We are grateful that you are here, and I am proud to be able to stand deep in solidarity with you all as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And lastly, I would like to introduce Robert Lilligren, President of the Native American Community Development Institute and a big brother.
I'm the oldest person up here.
At least to me, I guess.
Bonjour and dinner Meganaduk. I am Robert Lilligren. I'm the CEO of the Native American Community Development Institute. I'm also a citizen of the White Earth Ojibwe Nation. And I greeted you in Ojibwe, my grandmother's first language. I greeted you as relatives. And relatives means, of course, the people that are here. That means we're relatives to everything. The sky, the land, the water, all living things, and each other. And that's a core perspective of a lot of indigenous cultures here in this country, that we are all related. And it changes your perspective a little when you look at everything and everyone as a relative. And you strive to be a good relative, to treat others as you would treat a relative, as you would want your relatives treated. And so I am so grateful and really humbled to be able to stand in solidarity with this beautiful, colorful diversity of community and really lifting up our Asian Pacific Island neighbors, but also everyone here in Minneapolis. I'm so grateful, Representative Omar, to be invited here. And as my congressperson, I'm just grateful that you fight this fight every day in the face of incredible hate and incredible oppression. And so thank you. And that it's not enough for me to stand sort of against hate, against racism, but I want to stand for progress, for love, for everyone that's up here. And this is America, this is Minneapolis, this is our community. These are incredible assets, the communities that the people here represent. They are what we will build the future of America on. And I am just so grateful to be here. And finally, I play a number of roles in the community. Another is I'm in the leadership of a group called Metropolitan Urban Indian Directors. It's a 50-year strong leadership forum comprised of some 36 Native agencies across the Twin Cities. And Metropolitan Urban Indian Directors, MUID is the acronym, MUD, as we say in the Native community, has voted to stand, to put out statements standing with our API community, supporting them as we have with our Black communities after the murder of George Floyd, as we have with our Jewish communities, because we understand that we are here not just for ourselves, but we are here to be good relatives. Be rich.
Well, thank you all. As I've said and has been repeated, attack against one of us is an attack against all of us. We oftentimes say this is not who we are, but the reality is, it is who we are. It is happening. It is an actual fact that hate exists in our communities, and because it's being ignored, it's leading to violence, and it's having a dramatic impact on all of our communities. And so I hope we do start the practice of saying this is not who we want to be, because then that gives us the ability to take actionable steps in ending this catastrophe that we are all witnessing, that is stopping us from living a full, fulfilling lives as members of this society. It is cold, so I will take one or two questions. If any of you have burning questions.
Can you, Congresswoman, or anyone here, can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
you can. Yeah.
right. Quantify to what extent these attacks of Asians and Pacific Islanders are a problem in Minnesota. Is there data or no?
Partnership with the Minnesota Department of Human Rights established a helpline that began last year. And communities have been calling and reporting incidents, but we know that most people still feel pretty uncomfortable calling because they're not sure what kind of help they are supposed to be getting. So we still hear about that, but we do have some data, although I don't have it with me today. But yeah, we can get that information.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Other than a speakers list, if you have one, that would be great.
Oh, a speakers list? Yes, I do.
Spelling, so we don't slaughter anybody's name.
Much appreciated.
Yes, sir.
Because I don't think I've done a really great job at pronouncing their names correctly.
Well,
No, I'll give you a list.
If what was spelled on TV is what the graphics were up to me, it would be in like a food.
Yeah, I'll give it, and then I think my staff will send a follow-up.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank